The text came at 4:47 in the afternoon on Christmas Eve. I had already wrapped the gifts. I had already bought the food she had asked me to bring. I had already driven 40 minutes in the direction of her house when my phone buzzed on the passenger seat and I pulled over to read it. It said, "Dad, we decided to keep it just immediate family on Brett's side this year. Hope you have a good holiday." That was the whole message. No call beforehand. No warning. No sorry. Just that one sentence sent while I was already on the road, already dressed, already carrying everything I thought she wanted me to bring. I sat in the parked car on the side of a highway on Christmas Eve and read it 3 times. And the thing that broke me was not the words. It was the timestamp, because she had known. She had known all week, and she had waited until I was already in the car. Before I tell you what I did next and what I eventually found out, I need to ask you something. What would you have called that text? A mistake, bad timing, or something more deliberate than either of those things? Because that question, the question of whether it was careless or calculated, is the question that drove the next 6 months of my life. Stay with me, because the answer was not what I expected. And once I found it, I could not unfind it. My name is David. I am 58 years old. I worked for 31 years in logistics management, raised my daughter mostly alone after her mother, and I divorced when Cassie was 9, paid for her college, paid for her wedding, showed up to every important moment of her adult life with whatever she needed, and never once asked her to thank me for it. I say that not to make myself sound like a saint. I say it because context matters. Because when a story starts with a man sitting on the side of a highway on Christmas Eve, reading a text that tells him he is not wanted, you need to know what that man had given before you can understand what that text actually cost him. Cassie was 31. She had been married to Brett for 4 years. Brett was from a large, loud, closely bonded family that gathered for every holiday with the kind of enthusiasm that looked, from the outside, like something you would want to be part of. His mother, Diane, was the center of all of it. She organized everything. She decided who sat where. She decided what the traditions were and which ones mattered and which ones were open to new additions. I had been at 3 of their Christmas gatherings since Cassie and Brett got married, and each time I had gone, I had felt like a guest who had been allowed in on a trial basis. Not because anyone was directly rude, but because the warmth in that room had clear boundaries and I was always just outside them. I had told myself it was normal, new family dynamics, different backgrounds. I was a quiet man from a smaller family and they were a large family with established rhythms. I told myself I just needed more time. I did not have more time. I had a text. I sat in the parked car for about 10 minutes. I called Cassie. She did not answer. I called her again. She did not answer. I sent a message asking her to call me when she could. Then I sat and looked at the road and thought about what to do with a car full of gifts and food and nowhere to go on Christmas Eve. I want to be honest about what I felt. It was not just hurt. It was a specific kind of hurt that I think only parents understand. The kind that arrives when you realize the child you gave everything to has, in some quiet and official way, chosen a version of their life in which you are optional. It does not arrive like anger. It arrives like a door closing in a room you thought was yours. I turned the car around. I drove back toward home. On the way, I passed a neighborhood I knew well where my old friend Carl lived. Carl and I had known each other for 26 years. He was a widower, his kids were grown and scattered, and I knew without calling that he would be alone that evening. I pulled into his driveway on impulse. He opened the door in a sweater and socks and looked at me and said, "David, what are you doing here?" I held up the bag of food and said, "Cooking for two, apparently." He stepped back and let me in, and that was Christmas Eve. We ate well. We watched an old film. Carl fell asleep in his armchair before 10. I drove home after midnight and sat in my kitchen in the quiet and looked at my phone. Cassie had not called back. She had not sent another message. The original text was still there on the screen, still saying the same thing it had said on the highway, and I made a decision sitting at that kitchen table that I would not chase it. I would not call again that night. I would not send a hurt message. I would wait, and I would watch. Because something in that text felt wrong in a way I could not name yet, and I had learned over 58 years of living that unnamed wrongness usually had a name if you gave it enough. Time, Christmas morning, Cassie called. She was warm on the phone, too warm in a way that people are warm when they are covering something. She said she hoped I had a nice evening. She did not ask where I had spent it. She said Brett's family had decided late in the week to make it smaller this year, and it had just been easier. I said I understood. I kept my voice level. I asked how the evening had been, and she said it had been wonderful, really lovely, so good to be all together. I told her I was glad. I asked if we could get together in the coming days to exchange gifts. She said, of course, absolutely, she would look at the calendar and let me know. She did not let me know for 11 days. I want to talk about those 11 days because they were the days when I stopped explaining things away. I had spent years giving Cassie the benefit of the doubt on small things. A missed call that went unreturned for a week. A birthday dinner that got rescheduled twice, and then happened at a restaurant she chose that I had to drive an hour to reach. A graduation gift for her stepson, Brett's son, from a previous relationship, that I had bought and given personally, which she had thanked me for in a 3-word text. Individually, each of these things had felt like the friction of a busy adult life. Together, laid out in those 11 quiet days after Christmas, they formed a different picture. I started writing things down. Not in any dramatic way. I just opened a notes app on my phone and started listing dates and events, not to build a case, just to see what I actually remembered versus what I had chosen to soften. By the time Cassie called about getting together, I had 2 pages of notes, and looking at them made me feel something I had not expected, not anger, recognition. The slow, uncomfortable recognition of a pattern I had been looking at from too close to see clearly. We met for lunch on January 6th. Cassie was cheerful. She brought Brett, which she had not mentioned she would do, and which meant the conversation stayed light because it always stayed light when Brett was present. Brett was not a bad man. I want to be clear about that. He was pleasant, interested in sports and cars, and comfortable in the way that men are comfortable when they have never had to question their place in the room. He called me David and shook my hand and ate his lunch and contributed to the conversation in the easy way of someone who had no idea that anything was wrong. After lunch, Cassie hugged me in the parking lot and said it had been so good to see me. I handed her the gifts in a bag and she thanked me and put them in Brett's car. She did not open them there. She did not offer to. I drove home and sat with the notes on my phone and added one more entry. 11 days to schedule lunch. Brett present, no warning. Gifts put away without comment. None of this was explosive. None of this was the kind of thing you could take to another person and say, look at what she did. It was the accumulation of small refusals, small deprioritizations. The kind of thing that only the person on the receiving end fully feels, because from the outside it looks like ordinary busy life. But the Christmas Eve text had crossed a line that the small things had not. That text had been deliberate. I was increasingly certain of it, and the question of why it had been deliberate was the one I could not answer yet. The answer began to arrive in February in a way I had not anticipated, through a person I had not spoken to in almost 2 years. Her name was Patricia. She was the mother of one of Cassie's closest friends from college, a woman named Jenna. Patricia and I had met several times at events over the years when Cassie and Jenna were still close. Patricia was a straightforward woman, a retired nurse, not given to gossip or drama. When she called me out of the blue on a Tuesday afternoon in February, I was surprised enough to answer on the first ring. She said she had been going back and forth about whether to call. She said she had decided to call because she had a son of her own and she would want someone to tell her. I said, "Tell you what?" She said she needed to say something about the Christmas situation. I went very still. Patricia told me that Jenna had been at a gathering at Diane's house in early January. A dinner, not a large event, just a few of Brett's family and some of Cassie and Brett's closer friends. Patricia said Jenna had come home and told her something that had bothered Jenna enough to mention it unprompted. Jenna had told her mother that at this dinner Diane had spoken about me, not in passing, in a specific and pointed way. She had described me as difficult. She had said Cassie had been managing me for years. She had said the Christmas decision had been made to give Cassie a break from the obligation of including me. And she had said this in a room that included people who knew me, or at least knew of me, as if it were established. De fact, I want to sit with that for a moment. Diane had told a room of people, some of whom knew Cassie and me, that I was a burden my daughter needed a break from. She had framed the Christmas exclusion not as a family preference, but as an act of kindness toward Cassie. She had made me, without my knowledge and without any basis in truth, into a problem that needed managing. I thanked Patricia. I asked her to thank Jenna. I told her I was glad she had called. I ended the call and sat in my office for a long time without moving. This was the moment the picture sharpened. This was the moment the small list of events stopped feeling like friction and started feeling like evidence of something that had been built deliberately. Because if Diane was describing me to others as difficult and burdensome, she had been describing me that way to Cassie too, probably for years. And Cassie, who loved her husband and wanted peace in her marriage, and was surrounded by Brett's large and confident family every holiday and every gathering, had been receiving that description regularly, until it had shaped the way she saw me without her fully realizing it. I did not call Cassie, not yet. I needed to think carefully about what I knew, what I could verify, and what I was going to do with it. I had spent my career in logistics. The job had taught me one thing above all others. You do not move until you know where everything is. The next piece arrived 3 weeks later, and it was a proof object I had not gone looking for. It arrived in my email inbox, sent to the wrong address. Brett's email address was Brett Callahan at a common provider. My email address, which I had set up 20 years ago, was David Callahan at the same provider. Different first names, same last name, because Cassie had taken Brett's surname when they married, and somewhere along the line someone had created confusion in an address book. The email was from Diane. It was addressed to Brett. It had been sent to me by mistake. I read it before I understood what it was, and by the time I understood, I had read the whole thing. The email was about a property. Diane owned a lake house that she had been talking about transferring to Brett for several years. The email discussed the transfer timeline, the tax arrangement, and a detail that stopped me completely. It mentioned in passing that the arrangement they had discussed would be cleaner if Brett and Cassie's finances were fully separated from, and I am paraphrasing here because I will not reproduce the exact words, the ongoing obligation to Cassie's father. The ongoing obligation to Cassie's father. That was me. I was an obligation. And the financial transfer of a significant piece of property was being planned, at least in part, around minimizing my connection to Cassie and Brett's life. I forwarded the email to my personal archive. I did not reply to it. I did not tell Diane I had received it. I sat with it for 4 days. I want to be honest again about what I felt. It was not purely anger, though anger was present. What I felt most was a kind of cold clarity, the kind you feel when you finally understand a situation you have been confused about for a long time. Everything rearranged itself around this new information. The Christmas text, the distance in Cassie's warmth over the past year or two, the way Brett's family had always felt slightly closed, the way Diane organized everything and decided who belonged. I was not paranoid. I was not difficult. I was a man whose daughter's mother-in-law had decided, for reasons that had more to do with control and property than with any real grievance, that I was an inconvenience to be reduced. And Cassie did not know the full picture. I was almost certain of that, because Cassie was not a cruel person. She was a person who had been quietly managed by someone much more experienced at management than she was. In March, I contacted a financial advisor I had worked with for several years, a man named Gerald who was thorough, discreet, and very good at his job. I did not tell him the full story. I told him I wanted to review my estate planning and make sure my documentation was current. Gerald scheduled a meeting. We spent 2 hours going through my assets, my will, the accounts I had set up over the years, and several financial arrangements I had made informally over time. One of those informal arrangements was significant. When Cassie had bought her first home with Brett 4 years ago, I had contributed $40,000 toward the down payment. I had done it without conditions. I had not asked for paperwork. I had transferred the money from my personal account to Cassie's account and told her it was a gift. At the time, it had felt like the right thing to do. Gerald looked at the record of that transfer and asked me if I had any documentation of the intent. I told him I did not. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "David, I want you to think about a few things going forward." Gerald was not alarmist. He was careful. He said he was not suggesting anything was wrong. He was suggesting that informal financial arrangements with family members, particularly large ones, were worth documenting clearly, not for conflict, but for clarity. He helped me put together a letter that outlined the nature of the transfer, its history, and its classification as a completed gift. He also helped me review and update my will in ways that were not punitive but were precise. I named my specific assets clearly. I attached conditions to nothing, but I removed several vague provisions that had been written in the early years of Cassie's marriage that, in their current form, were generous in ways that assumed a relationship that no longer matched the actual one. I want to be clear about what I was doing. I was not punishing Cassie. I was not playing games with inheritance. I was a 58-year-old man with assets he had built over 30 years, and I was making sure that those assets were protected and directed clearly, because the events of the past several months had shown me that I had been operating on assumptions that were not grounded in the current reality. That is not revenge. That is responsibility. April came. Cassie called to ask if I wanted to come to a barbecue at their house in May. The invitation was warm and normal, and I accepted it without hesitation. I was not cold to her. I had no interest in being cold to her. She was my daughter, and I loved her, and whatever had been done to the space between us had been done primarily by someone other than her. The barbecue in May was the first time I had been to their home since the previous summer. There were about 20 people there, a mix of Brett's family and friends and a few of Cassie and Brett's mutual friends. Diane was there. She greeted me at the door with the kind of warmth that made me understand immediately that she did not know I had received her email. I watched Diane that afternoon the way you watch someone when you know something they do not know you know. She was impressive in her way. She moved through the gathering with total command, redirecting conversations, centering herself in every cluster, making sure that the tone and the energy of the event reflected her preferences. She laughed loudly and touched arms and called everyone by name and was, on the surface, the picture of generous hospitality. And underneath all of it was a woman who sent emails about property transfers and used phrases like ongoing obligation when she talked about her daughter-in-law's father. She came to me at one point with a plate of food and said she had heard I had a quiet Christmas and she hoped it had been restful. The word restful landed deliberately. She was checking whether I was still wounded. She wanted to know if the Christmas text had done what it was supposed to do. I smiled and said it had been a very good evening actually, quiet and warm, exactly what I had needed. I watched something shift very slightly in her expression, something small and controlled, and she moved on to the next person. That was the first moment I felt the reversal beginning, not because I had done anything dramatic, but because Diane had expected me to be diminished, and I was not. In June, Jenna contacted Cassie. I did not know this had happened until Cassie called me unexpectedly on a Wednesday evening. She said she had been talking to Jenna. She said Jenna had told her about the conversation at the January dinner, the one where Diane had described me as difficult and burdensome. Cassie's voice on the phone was careful in a way I recognized. It was the voice she used when she was trying to keep something contained. She said, "Dad, is that what you heard too?" I said yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why didn't you say something?" I said, "Because I wanted to understand the situation before I said anything." She was quiet again. Then she said, "What do you mean, the situation?" I told her there were some things I wanted to share with her when we could sit down together. I did not say it with pressure or urgency. I said it the way you say it when you have things to say and you want to say them properly. She agreed to come over the following Saturday. She came alone. Brett was not with her, and I had not asked her to come alone, so she had made that choice herself. She sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and she looked like someone who had been thinking hard for several days. I sat across from her, and I put 3 things on the table. The first was a printed copy of the email from Diane. I had redacted nothing. I told her it had come to me by mistake, addressed to Brett, wrong address in the contact list. I watched her read it. I watched her face go through several things in the space of about 90 seconds. She read it twice. She set it down. She said, "The ongoing obligation." I said, "Yes." She said nothing for a moment. The second thing I put on the table was a short printed summary of the transfers I had found in my records. Not to demand anything, not to make her feel guilty, just to show her what the financial picture of our relationship actually looked like, because I suspected she had not thought about it clearly in a long time. The $40,000 for the down payment, the college tuition, the wedding contribution, the various smaller gifts over the years. The total was significant. Not because I wanted it back, but because Diane had been describing me as a burden while I had been, factually, a substantial source of financial support in Cassie and Brett's life. Cassie looked at the summary for a long time. She said, "I knew about all of this." I said, "I know you did. I'm not showing it to you as a surprise. I'm showing it to you so we're both looking at the same picture." The third thing I put on the table was the notes from my phone. 2 pages of dates and events going back 18 months. Not everything, just the pattern, the rescheduled birthday dinner, the 3-word text for the stepson's gift, the 11 days to schedule lunch after Christmas, the Christmas Eve text timestamp. She read through it without speaking. When she finished, she looked up at me and her eyes were wet. She said, "Dad, I didn't know she was saying those things to people." I said, "I believe you." She said, "I didn't know she was saying them to Brett either, or to me." She stopped. Then she said it again quietly, as if she was hearing it herself for the first time. "Or to me." That was the sentence I had been waiting for, not from anger, not from vindication, but because it was the sentence that told me Cassie was starting to understand that she had been managed too. She asked me what I wanted. I told her the truth. I told her I did not want a war with Diane. I did not want to damage her marriage or create a conflict that would make her life harder. I told her what I wanted was to be her father, clearly, without conditions or management or the sense that my presence in her life was an obligation to be reduced. I told her I wanted her to know what had actually happened so she could make her own decisions about it with full information. That was all. She stayed for 3 hours. We talked about things we had not talked about in years. Her childhood, the divorce, and what it had been like for both of us. The early years with Brett when she had been so excited and so eager for everyone to get along that she had perhaps allowed things to slide that she should have addressed. She said she thought she had been trying to manage me to make things easier with Brett's family. She said she had not realized what that looked like from my side. She said the Christmas text had been Diane's idea. Diane had suggested it, and Cassie had agreed because it seemed simpler, and she had told herself she would make it up to me in the new year. She said she had convinced herself I was fine because I had not made a big thing of it. She said she had forgotten that I never make a big thing of anything. That last sentence was the most accurate thing said in that kitchen in a long time. After Cassie left, I sat for a while and felt something that was not quite peace and not quite resolution. It was more like a weight that had been pressing for months finally being named. Named things are manageable. Unnamed things grow in the dark. July arrived. Cassie had been thinking. I could tell from the way she called more often, the way the calls lasted longer, the way she started asking questions about my life rather than updating me about hers. She asked about Carl. She asked about my work. She asked if I was seeing anyone, which she had not asked in years, and the question made me laugh a little. She was reconnecting with me on her own terms, in her own time, and I did not push or pull. I let it happen. Brett was quieter than usual on the occasions I saw him. Not cold, just quieter. I suspected Cassie had talked to him. I did not ask about it. Diane called me in July. This surprised me more than almost anything else that happened in this story. She called on a Tuesday morning and was warm in the precise, controlled way she was warm at social events. She said she had been thinking about the past few months and wanted to make sure everything was good between us. She used that phrase. Everything is good, as if good were a setting you could check on and adjust. I told her I appreciated the call. I told her I was doing well. I kept my voice even. I said I was looking forward to seeing everyone at the summer gathering Cassie had mentioned. She said wonderful, it would be lovely to have everyone together. I said it would. The call lasted 4 minutes. I did not bring up the email. I did not bring up what Patricia and Jenna had told me. I did not bring up the ongoing obligation, not because I was hiding it, but because I did not need to. Diane knew that I knew. She had called. Because something in the landscape had shifted, and she was sophisticated enough to know it, even if she could not identify exactly what had changed. The call was her way of taking a reading, and my calm on the phone was the answer she got, which told her nothing she could use. There is a particular kind of power in being unreadable to someone who expected to have you figured out. The summer gathering was in August. I drove to Cassie and Brett's house on a Saturday afternoon, and the dynamic was different in ways that were visible to me and probably invisible to most of the people present. Diane was still warm and still commanding, but she came to me differently. There was a degree of care in her approach that had not been there at the May barbecue. Not deference exactly, something more like awareness. The awareness of a person who has realized that the situation is not entirely in their control anymore. Brett pulled me aside at one point near the end of the afternoon. He said he wanted to say something. He said he was sorry about Christmas. He said it had been a bad call and he should have pushed back on it. He said it simply and directly and without a lot of elaboration, which I respected. I told him I appreciated him saying it. I told him I understood that navigating family was complicated and I did not hold it against him. He nodded and we stood there for a moment and then rejoined the party. That conversation with Brett mattered more than it might look like from the outside. Because Brett was Diane's son, and Brett apologizing directly to me meant that something had moved in that household. It meant that Cassie had talked to him more thoroughly than I had realized. It meant that the email and the notes and the 3 hours at my kitchen table had done something that no confrontation, no argument, no wounded phone call could have done. They had given Cassie the facts she needed to have the conversation with her husband that she had not known she needed to have. Quiet strategy. Quiet outcome. September brought the next development in the property situation, and it arrived again through Gerald. Diane had moved forward with the Lake House transfer. It was done legally, clearly, and in Brett's name. Gerald had been tracking it as background information since I had mentioned the email to him in broad terms. He confirmed that the transfer was complete and that it was structured, as Diane had described in the email, to keep the asset clean and separate. Gerald pointed out something I had not fully considered. The way the transfer was structured, with Brett as sole owner rather than Brett and Cassie jointly, meant that if anything happened to the marriage, the lake house would not be a marital asset in most standard arrangements. It would be Brett's alone. I do not know if Cassie had been told this. I suspected she had not been told this because Cassie was a sharp woman and she would have had questions. I did not bring this to Cassie directly. I told her that it might be worth having an independent conversation with a family law attorney, not because anything was wrong, but because large property transfers within families sometimes had implications that were worth understanding. I kept it light. I kept it factual. She asked me why I was saying it. I told her I thought it was good practice for any married person to understand the financial structure of their household. She was quiet for a moment and then said she would think about it. 3 weeks later, she told me she had met with an attorney. She did not tell me everything that came out of that meeting. That was her right. But she called me afterward and said, "Thank you for telling me to do that." I said, "You would have figured it out eventually." She said, "Maybe, but you saved me some time." That phone call was one of the best moments of the year, October. The year was almost done. Cassie called and asked about Christmas. She said she wanted to do something with just us this year, just the two of us and Brett and maybe Carl if he was up for it. She said she wanted it small and easy and she wanted to cook for me. I told her that sounded exactly right. She laughed and said, "Don't get emotional, Dad." I said, "I'm not." I was a little. She also said something near the end of that call that I want to share because it is the part of this story that I think about most often. She said, "Dad, I think I've been letting other people's voices be louder than yours for a long time. Not on purpose, but I did it, and I'm sorry." I said, "Cassie, you don't owe me an apology for being human." She said, "I know, I'm giving you one anyway." That is my daughter. That is who she is underneath everything that had been layered on top of her. November. Diane had a birthday. Cassie organized a dinner at a restaurant. I was invited. I went. Diane was pleasant and gracious and made a point of coming to me early in the evening and telling me how glad she was I had come. I told her. I was glad to be there. I meant it, in the way you mean it when glad has grown past its original simple meaning and become something more complicated. I was glad because I was present and clear-eyed and no longer operating in the dark about what had been happening. I was glad because Cassie was across the table laughing and watching me with eyes that were open rather than careful. I was glad because I had done nothing dishonest, nothing unkind, and nothing that I could not look at directly in a well-lit room. Diane caught my eye at one point during the dinner and smiled. I smiled back. Whatever assessment she was making of me, I was comfortable letting her make it. I had stopped being a manageable quantity the moment I had started paying attention. And we both knew it, even though neither of us would ever say so. December came back around. A full year from the text on the highway. Christmas Eve arrived on a Sunday. Cassie had kept her word. She and Brett came to my house. She had asked to cook in my kitchen, which she had not done since she was a teenager. She arrived at 2 in the afternoon with grocery bags and a playlist and the comfortable confidence of someone who had decided where she wanted to be. Carl came at 5. Brett and Carl discovered, to everyone's amusement, that they shared an obsessive interest in a particular era of motor racing, and they talked about it across the dinner table with the enthusiasm of people who have found an unexpected ally. Cassie watched them and looked at me with an expression I recognized from when she was small, the expression of someone who is surprised by how good something feels. We ate late. We talked longer. Carl left at 9. Brett cleared the table without being asked, which Cassie noticed and which I noticed her noticing. After Brett went to check on something in the car, Cassie sat with me at the table with her wine glass and said, "This is better than last year." I said, "Yes." She said, "I mean by a lot." I said, "I know." She looked at her glass. She said, "I keep thinking about that text, what it must have felt like to read it on the highway." I said, "It was a hard moment." She said, "I want you to know it was the last time anything like that happens." I told her I believed her. I told her that was enough. And it was enough. It was exactly enough. I want to talk about what this year taught me, not as a lesson list, just as the honest accounting of a man who went through something and came out the other side with a clearer understanding of himself and the people he loves. I learned that silence is not the same as peace. I had been keeping quiet for years about small things, telling myself it was patience, telling myself I was being the steady one, the one who did not create problems. But silence about things that matter is not patience. It is avoidance. And the problem with avoidance is that it allows other people's narratives to fill the space you have left empty. Diane had filled the space I left empty. She had filled it with a version of me that suited her purposes. And I had helped her do it by never clearly occupying that space myself. I learned that documentation is not aggression. When I started writing things down, I felt strange about it, as if I were doing something adversarial. But the notes were just a record of reality. They helped me see clearly when emotions were pulling at my perception. They helped me present information to Cassie in a way that was calm rather than wounded. They helped me stay grounded when everything else felt unstable. There is nothing aggressive about knowing what actually happened. I learned that money and love are not the same thing, but they are related. The $40,000 I gave toward that down payment was an act of love. But it was also a real transfer of real resources, and the fact that it had been received in silence while I was simultaneously being described as a burden was a contradiction that needed to be named. Not because I wanted the money back. Because the contradiction itself was a form of disrespect, and disrespect needs to be seen clearly before it can be addressed. I learned that children can be managed by the people they love without knowing it. Cassie had not chosen to push me out. She had been gently, persistently, expertly guided toward a version of her life in which I occupied less and less space. Diane had done this not with cruelty, but with comfort, with belonging, with the constant implicit message that the real family was this one right here, and the connection to her father was a historical obligation rather than a living one. Cassie had absorbed that message without realizing she was absorbing it, and the moment she saw it clearly, she rejected it. That is who she is. I learned that the right move is almost never the loud one. I did not confront Diane. I did not send Cassie an angry message on Christmas Eve. I did not forward the email to Brett with a note attached. I did not ing a lawyer to the barbecue. I waited, I documented, I protected what needed protecting. I told the truth when the time was right, and I let the facts do the work that arguments never could have done. The loudest thing I did all year was put 3 pieces of paper on a kitchen table on a Saturday morning. And that was enough to change everything. I am 59 now. My daughter calls me twice a week. Brett invited me to a motor racing event in the spring, and I have said yes. Carl and I have a standing Friday dinner that neither of us has canceled yet. My finances are in order, my will is clear, my documentation is current, and I am not operating on assumptions about the people in my life. I know where I stand. I know what I have. I know what I am not willing to lose. Diane is still Diane. She organizes things. She centers herself. She makes decisions about who belongs where. But she does it now with the knowledge that the quiet man her daughter-in-law's father turned out to be is not one she can move without him noticing. That knowledge has, I think, made her approach me differently. Not warmly in a real way, but carefully. And careful is enough. Careful means the worst of what she was doing has stopped, because the conditions that made it easy no longer exist. Last month, Cassie told me she and Brett were thinking about starting a family. She said she wanted me to know early because she wanted me involved from the beginning, the real beginning, not the version that got communicated to me after the decisions had already been made. She said, "I want my kids to know their grandfather." I said, "They will." She said, "I know, I just needed to say it out loud." I thought about the man sitting on the side of the highway on Christmas Eve last year with a bag of food on the back seat and a phone showing a text that said just immediate family. I thought about how small that man felt in that moment, and I thought about how different this felt. Not because anyone had given me a trophy, not because I had won anything, but because the truth had been told and the people who mattered had heard it, and the space between us was no longer filled with someone else's version of who I was. I drove to Carl's that Christmas Eve because I had nowhere else to go. I drove to Cassie's this Christmas Eve because I was wanted there. The distance between those two evenings is exactly 1 year. And inside that year is everything that matters about what I want to tell you. Do not mistake quiet for resigned. Do not mistake patient for gone. Do not mistake the man who does not make a big thing of it for the man who does not notice. Some of us notice everything. We just wait until we know where to put what we see.